Good afternoon, everyone. That was just a test. Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, thank you. The State Library acknowledges this land that we meet on today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. Don't I sound good now? We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. We also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people visiting from other areas of Australia. Hello everyone, my name's Mark Gilbert. I'm the Exhibitions, Media and Marketing Librarian here at the State Library, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here today. I've given quite a number of presentations from our Stories from the Stack series over the years, but this is the first time I've ever been an interviewer. And wouldn't you know that the very first time I'm an interviewer, it's with one of the most successful and respected authors in Australia, Pip Williams, and with Peter Zajicek, one of Australia's most respected conservators and the State Library's longest serving employee. What a start for me.
Sound very old with that.
Pip's first novel, Dictionary of Lost Words, was published in 2020 and has been a worldwide smash, and it's gone on to be adapted as a play by the State Theatre Company with a repeat season next year. Sometimes I give tours of the State Library buildings to groups of people, and I've taken to leaving a copy of Dictionary of Lost Words next to our original editions of the Oxford English Dictionary. And as we go past that, and I'm trying to talk about the beautiful buildings and so forth, people stop me and start talking about the book, the Dictionary of Lost Words. The Bookbinder of Jericho was published last year, and like Pip's first book, was set in Oxford during a time of great upheaval and tragedy, but also great hope as the world stood on the precipice of change. The book particularly shows, I think, apart from her artistic talent, her talent for historical research and beautiful storytelling. And this passion for research brings us to our first question. Pip, this is the first question I've ever asked as an interviewer. Here I go.
Okay, are we all listening?
Pip, I know that in the past you spent quite a bit of time in academic research and writing, but how did you first begin to engage with the State Library of South Australia for your creative writing?
Excellent question. It's all uphill from here. So I used to be a social researcher. So research was something that I'd been doing for 25, 30 years before I became a novelist, something I always enjoyed. And so it seemed only natural that when I started writing stories, I would take the skills that I had developed over all those years and apply them to creating a story. And I think probably initially it was 80% procrastination, because research is a great way not to write. And for any writers in the audience, as much as we want to be doing it, sometimes sitting down and putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard can be quite difficult for some reason. There's a whole lot of psychological barriers that tell you just can't do this. And so I think I started with the research because it was something I knew how to do and there was less pressure. But mostly I couldn't really write a story about the Oxford English Dictionary, which was the story that had found me, I feel like, sometimes, without looking at the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. And so the first thing I did was just Google libraries in South Australia to see who had a copy. And the State Library was the only library that had a full set of the first edition of that dictionary. Adelaide University has the second edition, a full set, but you had a full set of the first edition, and it is the most beautiful set of dictionaries. I'm from Sydney, so occasionally I would visit Sydney and go to the Mitchell Library there. and I hope there's no one from Sydney, and I'm sorry if there is, but their collection of the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary is this sort of hodgepodge of volumes that they've just collected from all over the place, and it's very unsatisfactory to sort of sit down with them. None of them match. None of them are in the same sort of leather binding, and so it was actually quite a the research itself was a very physical thing, because I would have to come into the library. I'd have to walk up the spiral staircase to the little library you've got at the top of the turret there, the Simon Library, which is the most amazing place if you have an opportunity to visit. I think volunteers are up there for 2 hours a day or something. And it's full of dictionaries. It's full of the collections of a lawyer that used to live in Adelaide. I can't remember his first name, but Simon.
It's Josiah Simon?
Yeah, Josiah Simon. And he left all of the collection to the library as long as they were kept together. Is that right?
That's right.
And so that's where they are. And so I would spend the 2 hours up there and then get kicked out, because that's how long the volunteers could be up there. So eventually, I think it was Susie Keane who used to work here, she eventually had them all brought down to the reading room so I could come in whenever I needed to see them. And so really that's how I first came to the State Library in terms of researching those novels. And I honestly could not have written that book without having that unfettered access to those dictionaries, because in some ways the dictionaries in many ways they led the story, because, and it's different to looking at them by hand is so different to looking at them online, because if you look at a dictionary online, you simply look up the word you're interested in and you find the definition or the history of it or whatever. When you open a book and you're looking for a particular word, which I often did, you then go past a whole lot of other words on your journey to the word you're looking for, and it's those other words that helped me to tell the story. Yeah.
For a while after the book was published, we kept the Oxford English Dictionary in our reading room, and people would come to the information desk. It happened to me a few times on our information desk where people had actually come in and asked to see the Oxford English Dictionary that Pip Williams used to write the book. So we take them into our reading room to have a look.
I'm sorry I've caused all this work.
That's what we're here for. Now, Peter, I mentioned that you're our longest-serving employee. So if you can remember, how and when did you start at the library?
It's going to be hard, Mark. I mean, it does seem like a long time ago. I was 16 years old, just left school and really didn't know what I was going to be doing. And my father said to me, he said, make sure you get a job before I get back from my project work. So I came and applied for a bookbinder at the State Library. And my mother thought it was a bookmaker, which was quite different. It took a couple of years for that to sink in that it wasn't. But I started my journey here in the library at 16 years old, came in the doors and started working, standing up, where I'd been sitting on my bum most of my life. I'd actually had to stand up at a bench and do work. And the journey was not that impressive in the beginning. It was a bit of a hard yard to get started in life. But the biggest things that I kind of noticed were you were mixing with a group of people that you could call them by their first name instead of Mr. or Mrs. There was these little things that were the nuggets that kind of made a difference, that you are now in the workforce, paying taxes, but getting a wage. And the wage, I still have my first pay slip, which was $67 for the first week's wage. So it's got some good memories. So my journey has been here in the library, and I must say that a lot of the things through my work life have actually changed around me rather than me go looking for change. So I was very fortunate to be with a group of people that were very encourageable, because I was a bit of a rat bag in the early days. I couldn't sit still. I was always doing something different. I was always getting told to get back to work. But that led to a lot of fascinating journeys that I had while I was binding books here in the library. And they included, binding the book for the Queen and things like that, which kind of added lustre to my journey as I worked in the library. So it's been quite interesting.
How many people worked in the bindery when you first started, Pete?
52 52 people. So it was like, this was like a morning tea break was this amount of people. And these days I sit and have tea break on my own. So it's changed quite a bit. But yeah, there were a lot of people there.
No, that's not true. You do have friends in the place. They'll sit with you as well.
Too, I can see them around the room.
And Peter does work a lot on our exhibitions program as well. So he's a very highly regarded conservator and gives me a lot of advice, some of which I take. Pip, have any of your works, have any of the works or publications held by our library or any other library really influenced the development of your characters within the books?
Yeah, like I said, if the dictionary itself influenced the character of Esme in the Dictionary of Lost Words, because I'll just give you one example. Esme's story spans from the age of 4 to when she's well into adulthood, and so at different times I'm trying to think about, okay, how would this project of defining all of the words in the English language affect her at different stages of her life? And so when she's an adolescent and she's going through puberty, I'm curious about how defining the English language might affect her. So she doesn't, for those of you who haven't read the book, she is motherless and her father is looking after her, and the scriptorium, where all the words are being defined and stored in pigeonholes around the place or published in volumes as they came out. Those words, in a way, are helping to parent her. So when she doesn't understand something, she goes to the pigeonholes or she goes to the volumes that have been published and she tries to find out what her experience means by looking up the words she's been given in the dictionary or in the pigeonholes. When her period starts, her father can't explain it to her, and she hears all sorts of words from people around her and she starts to look them up in the pigeonholes and the dictionary. So I started to look them up in the volumes that you have here. And what's really interesting is the words that we use today were not used back then. So I looked up period, and the first thing, for instance, that the first definitions I came across, I mean, the way we use period now was not, I don't even think it was in the dictionary in the first edition. And so I'm curious, and so I looked up menstruation and more medical terms, but the word they used was catamenia. I had never heard of it. And so in some ways, this helped me to develop her character. So the words that she was hearing was curse and a whole lot of other kind of colloquial or slang terms that women would use to describe their period and the experience of having a period. And the other words she was given were medical terms that her father would just look up in the dictionary, and none of them applied to what she was feeling. And when she looked up things like curse, she would get all these terrible definitions about what she was experiencing and who she was becoming. And so that helped me to, I suppose, develop her character, but also develop her scepticism and questioning of this male project, which is to define the language, because the language she was hearing that applied to her, she was not happy with the definitions that she found in the dictionary, and yet she couldn't find anything that did accurately describe her experience. So that's one example.
I noticed in the Bookbinder of Jericho there was the odd Australian reference, including Dot and the kangaroo, which I rushed off to our catalogue to see what sort of holdings we've got.
So that was bound at Oxford University Press, Dot and the Kangaroo. So all of the books in Bookbinder of Jericho that I refer to, my main character Peggy having something to do with the binding, were actual books that were bound at that time at Oxford University Press. And you said, you asked, how did the research here influence the characters? Well, the truth is Peter influenced so much in that book. So Peter just described when he first started here as in the bindery, there were 52 people. And my memory is, you said it was divided into the girls' side and the men's side, which is exactly how it was divided at Oxford University Press. So it seems like the model here was the same as the model at Oxford University Press and other presses around the world, actually. And the model was that women did certain parts of the binding process, the folding, the sewing, and so on, and men did the other parts, the slightly more violent parts, really, but also the bits you could see. So all the work the women did got hidden.
Cover it up, that's right.
Yeah, and all the stuff the men did is what you see when you buy the book. It's the leather binding, it's the... yeah.
It does go together well, doesn't it?
Yeah, they do go together well. And I like to think, metaphorically, if not for the women, it wouldn't hold together. So,
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Very true.
Yeah, and Peter... I leaned very heavily on Peter. So first of all, I should say Lee is in the audience here. Lee is someone I got in touch with because, sorry Lee, I've forgotten your last name. Hayes, yeah, sorry. Lee is from, are you still at Adelaide University? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. But Lee had done this incredible exhibition of bookbinding at Adelaide University long before I started writing this book. But thankfully she digitised the whole thing and put it online. And I scrutinised it and read it and tried to understand it and then got in touch with Lee, and she agreed to have coffee with me to talk about bookbinding so that I could understand it, because I'd never bound a book. I have to admit, I'd never thought about how books were bound until I was doing research for the Dictionary of Lost Words at Oxford University Press, and I realised how all the processes and all the people that were part of the process of binding a book. That's what brought me to this story. Lee was very generous with her time and expertise and suggested I talk to Peter if I wanted to know more, which is how I came to the State Library and how I came to Peter. And pretty much everything, I would write scenes and about bookbinding and essentially ask Peter if they rang true. So Peter would read them and help me correct them if they needed correcting. But more importantly, he showed me how to bind a book.
That was the great journey, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Actually getting together and going through this process of watching somebody's enjoyment come out through their hands and telling stories about binding those books of yours, which was very satisfying for me, because I've certainly been on a trail in my industry where things have changed quite a bit. We weren't making books ruggedised so that they could stay on the shelf and be used. We were now moving into other areas, and the bookbinding had kind of slipped away a little bit. It was still on the horizon, but it wasn't being done as much as it used to be. But having you come through kind of got things going again, and it had to make me remember what actually goes into doing these things and making sure it didn't fall apart. And you did a very good job with all of your books.
Actually, no, let's be truthful. So Peter would show me how to do specific things at specific times when I needed to write about them. But when my book was published, or printed, not published, but when my book went to the printers, we asked if we could get pages from the printer so that I could bind them myself. And this is an example. We thought we should put a do not open sign on it just in case it fell apart.
It's not falling apart.
And I think when you came in, there was a video showing, which was the video of me binding a book. But there was a bit of jiggery pokery in there because
It had to be, didn't it?
because we had to film that in one day. So Peter and I spent weeks getting 7 copies of the book to different stages of the process,
Right.
so that we could film each process one after the other. And honestly, none of these books would hold together if Peter wasn't there to fix my mistakes. But I remember one day when Peter had taught me how to sew all of the sections together, and I felt pretty confident with that, and told him he could go off and have some lunch. And when he came back, I'd have this, this sorted. He came back and picked up the book that I had sewn together and just said, "Undo it." and start again. I'd forgotten some step, and I went, really? But
And that's why they're not falling apart. You see.
I couldn't believe that he would make me.
I remember you said
Start
that I told you very politely.
You did. You were very polite.
Very politely.
Even so. So I did. I did what the teacher said. I undid it and started again, and
And that's what it was like in the bindery. There was a lady that used to check everything that we did, and she was from Europe, and she'd sit there, and if you did anything wrong, she would just come up to you and give you the books back, and so you have to correct your own mistakes. There wasn't anybody else to do it for you. But apart from the process of doing these things, it's the journey with the people that you meet. And this lady that used to check the books had the tattoos on her arm. So her journey was a lot different than mine, but it's around the people that you mix with that you get the greatest experience, and certainly ones that stir up things too.
One of the kind of almost recurring theme, I suppose, or idea, I suppose, not so much a theme, is that whole idea of gathering the sections and dancing them into piles. That was something that kind of resonated with me. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, Pip, because it's quite a visual thing.
Well, actually, that is the kernel of the story. So when I was at Oxford University Press doing the last research trip for Dictionary of Lost Words, I was essentially, I'd finished the book more or less. I was just filling in a few gaps that I couldn't fill in from here. I had to be in the archive to get accurate information about this, that or the other thing. One of the scenes I wanted to work on was a section of that book where a book is being bound in secret in a way. I won't say what it is for anyone who hasn't read the book, but essentially a book is being bound without the knowledge of the controller of the press. And the bindery girls, as they were known, were helping in the binding of this book. So I wanted to know as much as possible about those women, the women who worked in the bindery. And I asked, Martin Moore is the archivist of Oxford University Press, I asked him if he could bring me everything that he had about the women who worked in the bindery. And at that time in history, during World War I, there were about 60-odd women working in the bindery at Oxford University Press. And the archives are full of boxes and materials about every part of the press and every department. But all he could bring me were 2 black and white photographs that were actually taken in the early 1920s, soon after the war, a farewell card, and when I say card, it was really a monograph. It had multiple pages, but a farewell card for the controller of the press when he left in 1915 that had been signed by everybody who worked at the press. And so one page was signed by all the women in the bindery, which was just golden. And the third thing that he brought me, or sort of reintroduced me to, was a film. You can actually see online. It's called The Making of a Book at Oxford University Press, I think. It goes for nearly 20 minutes and it's fantastic. It's a silent film, but it goes through every part of the process, from casting the little bits that are in the type that they might use to typeset a book, right through to the lorries taking the books to bookshops. And in 2 sections of that 20-minute film, there is footage of the women. So there's footage of the women folding the large sheets that have come off the press. And then there's this beautiful image of a woman gathering the sections that have been folded into her arms to create a text block or a book. And the bench that she's got all of the sections piled up on, hundreds of them in piles, is very long, and she's just moving along it. I have to move this away, but she's just gathering the sections so fast into her arm. She's so skilled, she's done it 1,000 times. I'm certain, though, that she knew she was going to be filmed that day because she's wearing quite nice shoes with a bit of a heel, no apron, and they always wore aprons. She's very nicely dressed. but she's so elegant, and it is like she's dancing. You know, there's footwork involved, and she's figured out the best footwork for the most efficient process to get from, you know, one section to a full text block. And as I watched this film, I just was curious about the book that she was gathering into her arms, and I stopped the film to see if I could peer in and have a look, but I couldn't. And it's not the sort of film you can kind of enlarge. And then I just wondered, I wonder if she ever stops to read what is in her arms. And then I wondered about the women folding the pages. Do they ever stop to read the pages that they're folding? Remembering that the books that they were publishing at Oxford University Press included trade books, but they published all of the books that were written by the academics and scholars at Oxford University. So you've got this bunch of working class women, a lot of them finished school at 12, and that's when they started in the bindery, sort of with no further education than that, surrounded by the knowledge and wisdom and thinking of the times. And I was so curious about whether there would be a woman in that group, and I know there would have been, who was interested in the knowledge and the wisdom and the thinking of those times, who might stop every now and then and read the words that she was folding day after day after day and wonder about them. And then as soon as I had that thought, I knew that if she did do that, she'd slow down production, a supervisor would come over and tell her that her job is to bind the books, not read them. And that's when I had my next book, but I had to put it aside because I hadn't finished the last one. But yeah, so that it was that image that you're talking about of the woman gathering the sections that actually gave me the whole book very quickly in that moment when I saw it.
I mean, there is so much in the book, as we probably all know here. There is that separateness. I'll just go back a step because Peter has told me a story about when, you know, he first started, about that whole divide between the male and female staff here at the State Library that wasn't, you know, in 1914. It's a bit more recent.
It certainly was a bit more recent. I mean, that was one eye-opener when I came in here, that there was a clear division. And we had tea breaks separate, so the men had the tea breaks down their end, the girls had their tea breaks at the other end. We might get to say hello to them, but that would be about it. But one of the funniest of times was we had a bit of an uprising in the bindery, and we got rid of the boss because he wasn't doing the right things. And I remember having to write a report about how an apprenticeship wasn't being completely fulfilled, and I wasn't getting my pound of flesh to know everything that goes on in bookbinding. I was only getting the end part on putting the covers on. So we got rid of the boss, and they took me and they put me down the other end with all these girls. And boy, was it an interesting time. But they did teach me to sew books, and that was one thing that I really took away from that. So those sort of memories are pearlers in, really, when you think of that industry was like that in those days, and it was so difficult to see it any differently than that. But it did change in time.
Well, isn't it interesting? Because if they hadn't taught you to sew books, you wouldn't have been able to teach me how to sew books. Right. So I'm grateful for the uprising.
Well, the library was far more regimented then too, I think, wasn't it? You know, people had to take tea breaks at different... The librarians took tea breaks at a certain point. The people from the bindery would have to be at a separate place to take their tea break. But you'd be pleased to know we all drink tea together now, don't we?
We do, but in those days it was very different. We weren't allowed to use the lift. We had to take our aprons off before we went upstairs. So there was a real divide between some of the staff. So an interesting time.
And there is that separateness too in the bookbinder of Jericho, particularly with Peggy and her, I suppose, aim to become a student, but there was that whole town and gown sort of separateness in Oxford. And I suppose when I was reading it, I was surprised just how rigid it was. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was, and I just thought how hard it was for her to even get close to becoming a student.
So there were a whole lot of things. Just as a summary for anyone who doesn't know about the book, the Bookbinder of Jericho is about a woman who works in the bindery at Oxford University Press who would prefer to be a scholar. She'd prefer to read the books than bind them. And every morning when she comes to work, anyone who's, some of you have probably been to Oxford, some of you may have been to Jericho, which is where this book is set. It's a neighbourhood of Oxford. But Oxford University Press is clearly a university building. It's enormous, it's grand, it's stone. The rest of Jericho is was extremely working class. But Peggy would come to work every day and walk into the press, but look across Walton Street, across the road. And across the road was Somerville College, and it's still across the road from the press. And essentially the whole book is about her desire to walk from one side of the street to the other. It's very metaphorical. She just wanted, rather than being a servant of the university, which is what she was as a press employee, she wanted to be a scholar of the university. That's all she desired. But of course there were so many things in her way, in any woman's way back then, and her gender was one of them. So while there were a few women's colleges at Oxford at that time, 1914 we're talking about, they'd been around since the first women's colleges were set up in the 1870s and 1880s, but they could not get a degree from that university. So they could study there, but they couldn't get a degree there. And so even in 1914, although Peggy wanted to be a student of Oxford University, she would never have been able to get a degree from Oxford University. So even getting into those women's colleges was difficult because it required funds. On the whole, there were a few scholarships, but not a lot. And so Peggy had her gender going against her, but she had her class absolutely going against her in so many ways. So it wasn't just that she was working class and couldn't afford to go to university, it's that she was working class and was never expected to go to university. And in Jericho at that time, the press, it was a bit like a company town. The press dominated the employment of all of the families who lived in Jericho. About 60%, I think, of people were somehow employed or associated with the press. And the kids went to St Barnabas Primary School. They left when they were 12, and they got apprenticeships at the press where their parents worked. And so this would have been Peggy's trajectory. So it's expectations, the fact they leave school at 12. And when it comes to Oxford University, even when they started to allow women to participate, there was one key barrier to even participating in a degree course. So you wouldn't get the degree, but you could study the subjects along with the men. And that's the fact that you had to have ancient Greek as a prerequisite to enter the degree course. And it's one of those things, and we still have these kinds of barriers today in education where, sure, you're allowed in. We're totally inclusive. We'll let anybody apply as long as you tick these boxes. And one of the boxes for Oxford was ancient Greek, which wasn't taught at comprehensive schools. Working class kids were never taught ancient Greek. They might be taught a little Latin because they could use that at church, but they weren't taught Greek. And so it's this nice, not so subtle way of keeping certain people from tertiary education. So she had a lot of things going against her. But war changes everything for everybody, for bad mostly. But, you know, there are some things that change. And for women, war has always had devastating outcomes, but there's also been changes that have benefited them in the longer term.
I also had to remind myself every now and again that British women didn't have the vote at the time. Of course, in South Australia, as we all know, we women here did.
We are so proud of that. It was an accident, by the way, that we had full suffrage here. So it was never meant to be, but who cares how we got it.
But it's just interesting when I think her friend whose name just escapes me,
Gwen.
talks about, it was going to be a gradual movement, and the wealthier women could get the vote first, as long as I think they were over 30. Yeah. And sooner or later you'll get it as well. So there is that whole class thing.
Yeah, so when women have been fighting for the vote in the UK for decades and decades, and prior to World War I, the suffrage movement had really ramped up, and the suffragettes had become very important in that movement. The suffragettes are a particular group of women who were fighting for suffrage. They consisted of the women who were part of the WSPU, or Emmeline Pankhurst's group. And there was a lot of division, like there is in all sorts of movements within the suffrage movement. So a lot of suffragists did not agree with the strategies of the suffragettes. It's a whole other... I didn't know any of this, though, before I started writing that book. It's fascinating history. When the war started... So before the war, there were a whole lot of women in prison being force-fed and blah, blah, blah for their illegal protests and the things that they had done. When the war started, Emmeline Pankhurst struck a deal essentially with the government saying they would support the war. The WSPU would support the war and they would pull back on their suffrage movement. And essentially what happened is the women were released from prison and they supported the war, and they enacted the White Feather campaign, which wasn't their idea, but they did agree to enact it. It was a parliamentarian's idea. Other women in other suffrage groups were anti-war. And so, the women's suffrage movement was quite divided on the war and whether or not they would support it and how they would support or not support it. But one of the things that happened is women had been fighting for suffrage all these decades, and what became clear is one of the main arguments for women not getting suffrage was that they were not in a position and not equipped to essentially be decision makers in society, or to contribute in a way that that gave them a valid vote. But what became clear is that the country would have collapsed without women, that women stepped into men's jobs, men's roles. They kept the country running. And so in February 1918, before the war had even ended, a bill was passed and women were given suffrage, but only if they were they had to be 30 or above, but the main criteria was they had to have land or a degree. And women who'd even gone to Oxford University could not get a degree, even if they'd done all the degree courses. So there were all these limitations placed on their suffrage. And working class women, who were the ones who'd stepped into all the jobs, who'd become policemen and posties and driven trains, etc., they were not given any of these rights for another 10 years. So, again, a very class-based outcome.
Talking about the bookbinder of Jericho, Peter, I just wonder, what are some of the traditional bookbinding techniques that Pip incorporated into the book, and how do you think they enrich the story?
Well, it's certainly the journey of working with Pip that made it really interesting, that we needed to put together some pages and books. And these processes that you talk about come together to create something at the end of it. And we did that very well with the books that you brought through. A lot of the traditional techniques, like sewing books together, these are very basic techniques that we went through. But we arrived at having something that stayed together, and you can see it on exhibition here up the front, is the works themselves. But just on that note, just saying that, thinking to myself that part of the suffrage petition, I've had a hand in contributing towards that. So back in 91, we had this original suffrage petition come into the library to be looked at, with the end result of having it taken care of better than what it was. It was divided into 10 separate rolls that had been cut up, and we went about the conservation work of the petition and putting it back together in panels so it could be displayed and shown off. So that was another kind of highlighted thing that popped into my head when you were talking about that. Oh, 1860 something. Yeah. There you go.
I'm sure there'll be someone in the room that will correct me, but I think it's 1893.
Yeah. Yeah.
Could be 1892. 1890s. Let's go for 1890s.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, so anyway, going back to the books themselves have got some traditional techniques that have been around for years, putting the books together, and we embarked on that journey.
Yeah, and had we not, so some of the things I wrote about in the Bookbinder of Jericho, I wrote about the folding of the sheets that come off the press, and Peter showed me how to do that. It's more complicated than you think. And so there's a lot of folding in the novel. The sewing of the sections, the gathering of the sections. Now, even in Peggy's time, the sewing would have been done by machine. Though some books would have been still sewn by hand, and at Oxford University Press. And this is a whole thread through the novel that I wouldn't have done if you hadn't given me the idea. And it's the book repair room. So one of the secondary characters, Ebenezer, is a book repairer, and I did know that Oxford University Press had a book repair room, so a lot of very old volumes, just like you do here still, needed to be conserved or rebound. And Oxford University Press had a room that was dedicated to that work. And I made it that there was a woman who would help with some of the female processes in that conservation or rebinding of books, including the sewing, which would have to be done by hand in order to conserve particular books. And so that was something that came out of our discussions, actually, and particularly because library binderies are very different to, say, Oxford University Press, in that you take books apart and put them back together.
That's right, yeah. For a reason.
Yeah, for good reason, to stabilise them and reinforce them. And so those processes became more important in the book repair room, where I could show a book being pulled apart in order to be put back together, and I would not have put that in at all if not for our conversations.
Yeah, it was a real interesting time because working with something that's new compared to working with things that are very old. We all age gracefully, including books, and it's not quite the same when you come to repairing books when they're very old. You have to take a lot more care with that sort of thing. So encountering that and then being thrust back to having brand new pages to put together made a big difference. So there are different techniques and there's a lot of history in these books. So it's been interesting.
Often when I take things over for Peter to have a look at, whether it's for exhibitions or I found a book upstairs that's been damaged, the first thing I notice that he does, instead of me flipping pages or whatever I'm going to do, he just stands back and looks at it. It's the first thing he does. Takes some time looking at it.
Usually the first thing I look at is in the backs of the books we used to bind in the library. The girls that used to sew the books used to write their name in the back margin. So the books themselves, apart from just the title that you read and the date on the back of the book, have more history about them that you can go and discover. And there has been cases of books here in the library where they've actually embedded the title of the publication in the making of the paper. And we have examples of that in our rare book room. But I put Pip on the journey, and I think you did that with your books. You've written in the back of her books. The bookseller would write their name in there, so they did have some ownership to the book.
And that, I remember you telling me that story, and I went home and looked at some of the old books that I've got at home, because whenever I've written any of these novels, I've always tried to actually get hold of, as close as possible, an original copy or the copy that my characters might have handled. So with the Bookbinder of Jericho, I actually tried to source. It's divided into 5 sections, and each section is headed by a book that Peggy would have been working on at that time. And I tried to source those books and those editions so that I actually knew what they looked like and felt like and so on. So I have a few old books. And Peter had told me this little anecdote about the women in the bindery just putting their initials right at the back of the book. And on the whole, that would get covered up with the sort of end papers.
The MP.
But I had a look at one of my books, and there was a little signature, or just the initials of who I think would have been the woman who had gathered those sections together. And I included that idea in the story. I honestly, I think that was just a bit of luck, because I've got a lot of old books, and only one of them has that, but one of them does. And so that means that someone has done that. And I like the idea that these women who were completely invisible and their work was almost made invisible, you know, they'd done a good job essentially if their work couldn't be seen, that occasionally in a subversive way they would make themselves known and claim their work. Yeah.
Yeah, and we also used to use that if any of the sections got sewn around the wrong way. Go back and know who did it.
So I think we'll just finish up with one more question. It might be a little bit superfluous given the way that the conversation's gone, but I just wonder if there's one moment during the collaboration between the two of you that really stands out as being particularly meaningful or transformative. And I think I'll ask you first, Pete.
Well, anything that stands out, I think it was this lady's keenness to be always at the door, wanting to learn a little bit more about bookbinding, and it could have stirred me up enough to make it a very enjoyable experience. So that was certainly one.
Oh, mine's easy, that you actually opened the door. Thank you.
And she hasn't come since.
Honestly, that could be interpreted in so many ways. She's just always there knocking on the door. So how do you do this?
All in a good way, Pete.
But yeah, right from the beginning, Peter was so generous with his time and expertise. I felt also incredibly fortunate to have caught you at the end. You know,
be careful with the age.
Sorry, but caught you at this moment in time as the last bookbinder at the library. You know, from a time when there were more than 50. And this is something that I didn't really realise until I'd published the book and started talking about it. But I really hope that in writing this book, I am honouring the people who make our books, because everybody here loves books. I have always loved books, and I'm ashamed to say I never once thought of the people who allowed me to hold a book in my hand. It's a very different process today. The first time someone touches a book today is the bookseller who unwraps it out of the plastic, because a machine can do everything in a commercial book like this. But back in the day, you know, you would have many, many, many people's hands on those pages that you finally open. And I wanted to honour those people. What I realise is that there are very few commercial bookbinders left, because the industry has changed so much. There are many, many conservators and people who do bookbinding for a hobby, and it's still a incredibly valuable skill to have if you want to preserve books or have bespoke binding of books. But what I realise is that I have written about something that there are many, many people who are around who have done this. At almost every talk I do, people come up and say, I was a bookbinder at blah, blah. You know, I was a woman who worked in on the girls' side of a bindery in such and such, because, you know, like you said, in the 70s and 80s, it was still done this way. So it's not that long ago, but it's not done this way anymore. So it is a profession that has changed enormously over the last couple of decades, and we're losing the skills and expertise. Yeah.
Thank you, Pip. Luckily, we're not losing the skills of beautiful writing.
Let's see. I'm working on my third novel.
No clues? Would you like to give us a clue?
No, I don't mind talking about it. I'm probably halfway through. I was going to write something contemporary, and I started writing something contemporary, but then one of the characters from these other books started bothering me and and insisting I tell a little part of her story. So I'm writing a story about Tilda, who is in both novels. Yeah, but it will be a very different type of story. But yeah, some familiar characters.
Wonderful. We all look forward to that. Can I ask you to put your hands together for Pip and Peter? Now, this is our last Stories from the Stacks talk for this year, but we are planning a whole range of talks for next year on many and varied subjects, including a range of talks for our next exhibition, which is entitled Rear Vision, the Holden Collection. The State Library holds the Holden Motor Company archive here. That will be from the 28th of February. And you might have seen on the sign earlier that our Christmas display is in the process of being installed in the Mortlock. I do happen to know that the tree's up. The rest of the display is coming in over the next few days and week or so. I will also point out that Pip's books are for sale down the back there, and she's very happy to stay around for a little while and sign them. So thank you all for coming. We do have time for 2 or 3 questions. If you'd like to put a hand up, and the microphone won't work for you, I'm afraid. Well, I could try it, I suppose.
I can repeat the question.